Yeah, I should have been looking at this instead of going off on politics here.
We got this, Todd.
Well, I'm not worried about me.
Oh, you're worried about me? Great. Great. Let me know how you really feel.
Welcome back to Sermon Rewind. My name is Todd, and with me, as always, is DJ Jazzy Jordan.
Afternoon, y'all.
How you doing?
Doing well, man. How about you?
I'm doing well. We are still going. We're still here.
2 weeks strong.
Yes. So we are in week 2 of a new sermon series called Around the Dinner Table. Mm-hmm. And the premise of the sermon series is a number of topics, not an exhaustive list, but certainly a list of topics that are, shall we say, awkward.
Yeah.
Can solicit some very strong reactions, and therefore families and cocktail parties and churches will avoid them.
Absolutely.
Right?
As best they can.
Yeah. So today, the topic was wealth and poverty. And again, multiple texts, including Proverbs 30, verses 8 and 9, if I wrote that down correctly.
You did.
Okay. And your big idea was neither wealth nor simplicity save you from real life, only Jesus does.
Yeah.
Okay. You started the sermon talking about a relative level of financial wealth, say compared between the 1950s and today.
Yep.
And you were saying, assuming, and I'm assuming it is correct, that compared to the 1950s, a lot of people in our country have more disposable income.
Yeah.
More cars, more trips, more eating out.
Yep.
And along with that are statistics that point to the general idea or conclusion that we aren't any happier.
Right.
We can say the oft-used phrase, money can't buy happiness. And as it turns out, it hasn't.
Not at all.
We're affluent, we have access to a lot of financial resources, and yet we report high levels of dissatisfaction, high levels of depression.
Yep.
Your big idea, if I may, if I understood what you're talking about, was that earthly wealth will not give us true happiness, but neither will us completely trying to deny ourselves of everything, trying to impoverish ourselves.
Correct, yeah.
You talked impoverished. There's also a very interesting, and we won't go down this rabbit hole, but there's a minimalist movement.
Yeah.
Where people try to go the opposite of the American way of life. Mm-hmm. Tiny houses, getting rid of all their stuff.
Yep.
Right? And that gets to your big idea, okay? Only Jesus can give us this happiness. So let me jump right into the first point. And your first point was both the rich and poor will have to deal with real problems. Mm-hmm. And you sort of talked a little bit about, what rich and poor means. It's kind of a sliding scale. It sort of depends on where you are and who you're talking to and who you hang out with, that sort of thing.
Yeah.
Right. When it comes to this construct, and you listed a few statistics about, this percentage of the world lives on, say, less than $5 a day, right? Can we, and I use that term loosely, can we in Western society really understand what that means? Can we put ourselves into a mindset of people that genuinely give us, Lord, our daily bread, and sometimes the bread does not appear?
Right.
Right. Can we even understand that?
Very few people. I mean, I know there certainly are, a percentage of the community here in America that do live under that kind of duress and have budgets that are maybe that or less. But far and wide, by and large, the bulk majority of everybody, we're spending $5 without even realizing we're spending it, right? So no, there's such an incredible distance and discrepancy between the poor and the wealthy that Americans don't even realize how wealthy we actually are. I mean, you can have people in our audience, and I'm sure there were this morning, that are like, my goodness, I'm not rich, right? And I think I even sort of challenged that. You have absolutely no idea how rich you are. You have no idea. The fact that you have a credit card, that you have access to that amount of money, you could spend it at any moment if you wanted to. It's 60% of the world doesn't even have access to that. So yeah, we have no idea how wealthy we are, and I don't think most people can understand just how bad it gets.
So you mentioned this a little bit, and you were talking about how richness and poorness is not just finances, and yet that is sort of how we orient. Mm-hmm. And part of that is, again, our culture, our approach to economics, that sort of thing. Is it are we able, or do we focus too much of the discussion around money? Because you could say, I have a rich life, or I have a rich existence, that sort of thing. And that can be relationships, that can be self-esteem, that can be community, that sort of thing. Do we focus too much on finances, and is there a way for us to kind of reorient how we evaluate our relative wealth, as it were?
Yeah, no, you had two questions there. I would say, no, I don't think we totally realize. And yes, we probably spend way too much energy on a number, right? A superficial monetary set of, numerals and dots. And yeah, I think we spend way too much energy, and we assume that this is sort of the ceiling for what rich or wealthy is, when the reality is, my goodness, I mean, just living in America, right? Even unemployed. Do you understand the amount of access you have to social services, which even by themselves put you above that 60% of the world's least financially viable, right? You could sit on your couch and do nothing, and you're going to make leaps and bounds more than most of the underdeveloped world. So yes, I think we do focus too much on money, and you have as a result people who would say, I am poor because I don't have a job and I don't have a steady paycheck. And you don't realize, no, you still have access to healthcare. You still have the ability to get food through programs, and good food, if you consider, again, the types that people have access to worldwide. So yeah, wealth is incredibly relative, and it's super broad. And no, I think we do make a huge mistake by simply deducing it to how much income we have coming in.
So in your second point, you said both the rich and poor in Christ will get to receive real joy. Mm-hmm. And pivoting the argument, you referenced 1 Timothy 6. And you were talking about, again, how real joy does not come from either the wealth of the world, nor in sort of a deficit perspective on, our lack of financial wealth.
Sure.
Right? And you did sort of discuss the idea that this is one of those things that is not terribly controversial, right?
Sure.
Lots of preachers will say, real joy does not come from this world. It comes from Jesus. And all the church people are going to nod and go, yes, of course, real joy comes from Jesus, right? Mm-hmm. And you get a couple people giving you some amens. But for the most part, we've heard this before. We've talked about this in other sermon rewinds, that I can know that in my, whether we call it my mind or my heart, but I still get up and I go to work. I still look at my paycheck. I still have a bank account, right? So how do I focus on the joy of Christ, and still do I ignore the challenges of food, shelter, clothing, and healthcare, what that's going to cost? And what about just more simple, tangible things? Can I look at my 401k and wonder whether or not it's going to be enough to cover those expenses when I'm older and maybe can't work as much?
Yeah, I would, and this is probably going to frustrate people because this is sort of an answer that's not an answer, but I don't even think that's the adequate response. The first point, for example, was that the rich and the poor will have to deal with real problems, right? So let's talk about some of those problems real quick. So death of loved ones suddenly, or cancer prognosis in you or in someone you care about, or the loss of a job, or fill in any number of blanks, right? Your marriage starts falling apart. These are real problems that no matter how much money you have, you can't escape them. They're going to eventually find you in some respects, right? So how we deal with those real problems is indicative of whether or not we have real supernatural Christ-filling joy as a result, right? So do those problems force us to run to trying to make more money, or to run to try to simplify our life only? Or are we able to weather those problems faithfully? And here's the caveat. The way you know that you are is what that 1 Timothy 6 text says, right? He says, rather, the rich ought to be generous, gracious, quick to give, abounding in their willingness to kind of unleash from their idols and money, and to take care of those who are in need. So create a scenario. Todd loses his job. Todd is not someone who finds joy in making money or finds satisfaction and comfort and security in how much he makes. The way you know that's true is the way that you cling to Jesus, and the way that even though you don't have any money coming in, you still use your money to serve him in this world. That's how you know it and make it known that you are ultimately being satisfied by something else. If you are one of those people who say, yes, I'm totally satisfied, but it's a complete spending freeze, we're not moving a penny, then it may be very true that your story is wrapped up in something else. I'm not saying that's always the case, nor that that's 100% true all the time. But I do think that it's a good framework for us to evaluate ourselves.
So along with that, and I'll go straight to point number 3, because you said why this is worth fighting for. And again, you acknowledged going into point 3 that this is something, again, where people would still agree with you and say, yeah, I should do that. We tend to want to make incremental changes. Right.
Yeah.
And we can very easily convince ourselves, oh, yeah, I'm with you, Jordan. Yeah. And if I'm in this scenario and you say, well, and I give and I tithe and I try to be generous and I try not to be too attached to earthly things and that sort of thing. I try to be content, which I will get to in a second. Mm-hmm. Do we need to do something a little more drastic as individuals, as the church? Should we look at it more as a kind of self-audit when you talk about this type of stuff? Because I imagine on a lot of topics, you don't necessarily want people to walk out the door and say, yeah, that was a pretty good sermon. Yeah, I had some good points. And sure, I'll go home and look at things a little bit. And, maybe I'll be a little less this and a little less that, or a little more that. Do we need to be a little bolder, a little more drastic, looking at the landscape the way that it is, looking at the church the way it is? Do we need to do a little deeper dive?
Absolutely. And you used all the right adjectives there. Drastic, maybe painful, stretching. Yeah, all that stuff is necessary. If you're doing basic maintenance on a car, right, and you think everything is fine, but it still has that weird knocking sound, eventually you're going to bite the bullet and probably get that whole thing torn apart. And you're going to excavate every square inch of that to try to figure out if that knock is something concerning or if the engine is running true. So yeah, the church needs to be far more consistent, not only in their self-evaluation, but their sacrificial efforts to provide evidence for a changed life, right? Know that your calling and election is sure, right? There is something to be said about making sure that we are putting our finger on the pulse and really evaluating our lives and practices. And so, yeah, just simply saying, hey, I'm not that attached to money. Do the diligent hard work once in a while of really testing that, right? Make it hurt a little bit. Really go out of your way to do something that you would not normally do and test whether or not there is some allegiance to things and people and places that it should not be, right? And then kill those things if they are. And reorient your worship to where it belongs and receive in your worship the undeserved blessing of grace and mercy and satisfied life.
So how do we do that in the context of the church? Because ultimately, and again, we are still using the structure of finances, right? Ultimately, we keep that pretty private, right? We don't walk usually into a Bible study or even an accountability group sometime and say, here's my portfolio. Here's what I give every month. Here I give of my finances, my time, that sort of thing. Is there a way for us to kind of do that? Should we be doing that? Should we be laying all of our relative riches or poorness in front of each other? Are we asking for trouble by everyone bringing in their books?
Well, let's just be honest. We know nobody will, or at least the bulk majority.
Well, not with that attitude.
Well, yeah, I don't know that I'm the indicator of whether or not it's working or not. However, I would strongly advise people build the types of faithful rapport with other believers that they can and are doing that. I can say with all sincerity, and I really mean it, I do have other brothers in the faith that I am very, very close to, that I do share that kind of stuff with. I do talk to them about that. They do talk to me about that, and we're talking about the very unique and intimate details of our life. Finances and our drives for minimalism for the sake of humbling and making better sense of our lives, those are things that we should have other people with their eyes on as well. So yes, I'll agree with you on that. If you couldn't sit in a small group setting on Wednesdays and say, guys, I want you to have a relative picture of what my life around money, what my life around simplicity, and what all my drive looks like around those things. I want to be open and transparent. If you can't do that in a small group, that's fine. But you should have at least another brother or sister in the Lord that you can. And you should trust people enough to like really, really know what's up with you. And not because it's like you have to have people that are in the know in your life, but you have to have someone that you allow to challenge you. Iron has to be able to sharpen iron. The only way that happens is if there's two equally invested parts rubbing up against one another. That can't be hyperbole, that can't be romanticized, that has to be real brass tacks. So yeah, if you want to know, if you believe that, if you want to know if your life reflects a belief in that, trust somebody close to you enough to really let them excavate that part of your life. And listen, if they come back to you and say, look, I love you, man, I don't think you're being super faithful here, then go before the Lord with that, right? But entrust yourself to faithful brothers and sisters. Do that. Otherwise, you have really run the risk of having kind of that neutral, beige, apathetic, lukewarm life. None of us really want that. So the church owes it to itself to talk about this stuff, to get poverty on the line, to get, simplicity on the line, to talk about our idolatry around money. Like we owe it to each other to get to the bottom of it and wrestle through it.
So I'll ask you one more question, and this sort of brings it again back to, and I know we keep sort of talking about how finance is our lens, but that's a little bit how we orient in terms of our resources. It's the thing that we have a hardest time giving up sometimes, although time is probably also the thing that we don't want to give up. You talked about contentedness at the end, and obviously you're talking about contentedness of our faith, right? Being assured by the grace of God that Christ will provide for us, right? Through all things. I can do all things through Christ who gives me strength. And even
if he doesn't, he's enough. Right? You are right, but yeah.
So the question probably that people sort of, and you talked about being sacrificial and testing and that sort of thing, right? We do live where we live. There are people that have access to resources, and there's always this kind of, tug of war because we don't always feel comfortable about defending, say, our lifestyles.
Sure.
Right? And again, I'm a hypocrite if I say, oh yeah, I should just be content. I would like to go on some additional vacations in my life. I like to eat out. I like to buy the occasional item that either entertains me or makes life a little bit easier around the house, that sort of thing. These are all things that I can pretty easily confess, and I can find plenty of affirmation even within the church.
Yeah.
So what do you say to somebody that says, well, again, yeah, I buy a few things, I spend some money, but I'm not as indulgent as those people? How do we know whether or not we are? Because you talked about testing, right? How do I know if I'm attached to my earthly wealth versus truly putting my happiness in the grace that God gives us?
Yeah, I think there's a number of ways to do that, and it's the same way. And I hate to use this scenario because I don't want anyone to think this is what I'm saying about them, but it's the same way you test substance addiction, right? You often in Narcotics Anonymous or Alcoholics Anonymous courses, one of the questions that they try to get you to give them some information on is when you're most bored, when you're most lonely, when you're most depressed, when you're most anxious, what are the things you feel deeply inclined to do in the midst of that? Are you someone who says, I need to get in the fellowship of believers, I need you to be in the Word, and I need to be praying, and I need to be meeting with Jesus, even if I'm going for a jog or I'm at the beach or whatever, I need to be in His presence? Or I'm just going to hop on Amazon and I'm just going to impulse shop, right? Or I'm going to go on a trip because I'm lonely and I'm just depressed with my life. There is a problem there, and one is indicative of the other. You're right. You should not feel bad about, I'm going to jet set tomorrow. I'm literally getting on a plane tomorrow. So obviously I don't have a problem with people going on vacation. And I don't have a problem with people owning property or making a comfortable lives for themselves. But you can know where your heart is sown by what happens when those real problems start happening again, right? So when your heart's tested, when your emotions are imbalanced, where are you running to? Are you spending money? Are you minimalizing your life, right? Are you cutting things out? Are you adding more to it? Or are you running to Jesus deeply and holistically believing that his person makes up your lack fully and completely. It's not that hard to tell. It's whether or not you're willing to put yourself, under the tutelage of that kind of a test.
All right. Safe travels.
Yeah. Thanks, man.
Thanks again for joining us on Sermon Rewind. Please leave us comments. We genuinely want to hear from you, whether it's comments or additional questions. Also, if you are in the area on Wednesday nights, we will be showing this video and also discussing some additional questions. We'd love to have you on our campus. Thanks again for listening to Sermon Rewind.
See you soon.